So I wanted to begin by showing you a picture here. A number of years ago in my first call, someone gave me a carving. I don't have it anymore, but it was much like this. It was in two-toned wood. And I wonder what you see here. You know, when I looked at this image the first time, or actually the first few days I had it, my eyes just were not working quite right, or my brain wasn't working right. And what I saw was the black section of that image. And when you look at the black pattern, what do you see? Nothing, right? It's just different random patterns, kind of an ink blot thing. But, and maybe all of you are smarter than me and see it quicker than me, but what happens if you focus on the white part of the writing? It's Jesus, right? The word Jesus is in there. My eyes didn't immediately see that for like a week, and I was like, why did this person give me a weird carving with all this random gibberish? Well, it's because it wasn't random carving. It had the word Jesus in it. So, you know, when I looked at that thing for the first time, I was literally missing Jesus. So last week's text, if you followed along, was the story of the Good Samaritan. I know Pastor Russ came and preached about that. That is the story directly before this story in the Gospel. And in that story, we are reminded in the Good Samaritan that God calls us to have an active faith of actually doing things, of actually getting our hands dirty. We're called in that story, it says, to serve our neighbor and to show compassion and love through the way, especially in how we care for hurting people, right? Vulnerable people. And that's kind of a clear message in that story. Our call to do things, our call to actually get involved and do actions. And if that's a story about doing, this week's story is kind of the flip side. Yes, we're called to service and action, as we heard about last week, but we also need to leave space in our lives to simply dwell in the presence of Jesus and receive, right? Not look to give, not look to do, but simply look to receive. So in this story, as we heard, Jesus has arrived in a house that's owned by, it says Martha, one of the sisters, has invited him in, and he is there doing what he does. He has all these people, these disciples, mostly men, gathered around him, and he is teaching. And you know, can you imagine, if you really believed it was the Son of God, having the privilege of having the Son of God in your home and teaching you? So this amazing privilege, and like we mentioned, in this house there are two sisters who live there. There is Martha and there is Mary. And Martha in this story is a doer. And you all know doers, right? Doers are people who don't like talking too much necessarily. They don't have any interest in it. They want to actually get things done. They're often in the kitchen or they're fixing things or whatever it is. But she is someone who wants to get her hands dirty. She's someone who wants to serve the meal. And we can imagine that back then it was a lot of work, right? Because there's no microwaves, there's no blenders, there's no appliances that are going to make cooking fast. Cooking took time, and so it was a lot of work because she had a lot of guests in that home. And so she is trying to do the best she can to show hospitality in the way that she knows to do, right? To make sure that a good meal is prepared in this home where she's inviting people. Meanwhile, we have the other sister, Mary. And you know, if I had to guess, I would guess Mary is kind of the thinker, the dreamer, the one who's pondering things. And Mary is just enamored by Jesus' teachings. It says she's sitting at his feet and she's just soaking it all in, whatever Jesus is teaching. I'd love to know what it was, but we don't get that part of the story. And there's that saying where we're all experts in something, which is to say that we all have something that just captivates our attention. You know, for some people it's sports, they can go on forever. For some people it's nature. My wife's like that. She can talk about all the animals she's ever seen. For some people it's cooking shows or politics or video games, whatever it is. I have a friend who's a weatherman, and he can watch the weather and talk about the weather just endlessly. And you know, after 2 minutes I'm like, okay, I'm done with the weather. I don't care. But he cares. He's very into it. Well, for Mary, it is hearing Jesus speak. She is hungry to learn. She is hungry to grow. And so even though there's a meal to be cooked in that home, and even though we have to imagine that the society of that day would have reminded her that it was her duty as one of the women of the house to help make a meal, Mary just can't turn away. And so what happens? Well, what happens is that in this story, Martha complains about Mary's inaction. In fact, she complains not to Mary directly, but she complains to, the principal. She tells Jesus, and it's funny the way she does it. She says, Jesus, don't you care? Don't you care, Jesus? Don't you care that I'm slaving in the kitchen and she's sitting here doing nothing? Don't you care, Jesus? We often say, don't you care, Jesus, in our lives? Don't you care about what's going on in my life? Well, Jesus responds in an interesting way by basically telling her, Martha, sometimes you need to stop worrying about doing and leave space in your life to just be, to just receive, right? Sometimes you need to leave space in your life for learning and growing and refilling and recharging. Sometimes we just need to be reminded, not of that we're doing in this moment, but we need to be reminded of why we do what we do in our faith. Now at this point, and I've heard it many times, and I felt it myself, I think many of us feel some pity for Martha, right? It might feel kind of harsh in this story. Poor Martha. I mean, after all, again, she's serving Jesus. She's serving for Jesus' sake. She's working hard to help others, which is what the story before was about, right? The Good Samaritan. And she is performing the duties as graciously as she knows how to do as a hostess. And it's worth knowing, in case we're worried he's being too hard on Martha, that Jesus doesn't tell Martha that what she's doing is wrong or bad. His point isn't that Martha is doing bad. His point is that Mary is doing good, right? It's a good thing for Martha to be courteous and to be a good host, but he says it's an even better thing for Mary to receive the blessing of Jesus. And here's the thing about Martha's action. She's so busy attending to serving Jesus that she's not really experiencing the blessing of Jesus' presence. Mary, on the other hand, is not attending to the normal duties of a hostess, but she is attending to what's even more important, which is Jesus himself. And it's worth thinking what it meant for Jesus to defend Mary in this way, in that time. Because let's keep in mind that in this society, both Jewish society and especially the Roman society that reigned over the known world in this age, men and women were not seen as equals, right? This was a time when in Roman law, which covered that whole area, Roman law held that women were the property of men and that a husband literally had life and death power over his wife, right? So women were way down here in that culture. And one of the reasons that society would have encouraged a woman to stay in the kitchen and not be around when a teacher is teaching, because in the eyes of most people in that society, women did not need to learn, because women were not, in their minds, capable of this kind of thing. It was sort of a leave the thinking and the learning and the sophistication to men kind of culture and put the women in the kitchen. And so when Jesus is defending Mary's desire to learn, he is actually defending her dignity as a human being. He is lifting up a woman and placing her on the same level as the men in that room. And he is pointing out in so many words that women, and that woman in particular, but all women in general, have as much a right to learn and grow in the presence of God as any man. And that was a pretty revolutionary thing for Jesus to do. And so, again, it's not that Martha's action was bad. That's not his point. It's just that Mary's action was good. Because Mary is not allowing lesser things to distract her from her mission of following Jesus. And we all have the capacity in our lives of faith to become distracted by lesser things, whatever those things are. As Christians, we have the capacity to fail to notice when Jesus is showing up, when Jesus is doing things. And sometimes we miscategorize what's happening. I know of a church where they had a really good pastor who kind of did a lot of good things in their community, and their community was changing. It had been a predominantly white neighborhood at one time, and kind of people who were traditionally Lutheran lived in that area, and the church had done quite well. But as time was going on, the neighborhood was changing, and the church was struggling to keep up. Well, there came to be a Korean pastor who asked, "Can we worship in your area and use your church?" And this pastor said, "Oh yeah, that's fine to do." And so this Korean church started worshiping in that space, and it started doing really, really well. They were bringing in families and kids and young and old, and it was this growing church at the same time that the primary church, or the church that owned the building, was kind of struggling. And so they kind of both lived alongside each other. Everyone seemed pretty happy while that pastor was there. Eventually that pastor left the church and moved on to the next thing. And it turned out that almost as soon as that pastor left, all these people came out of the woodwork and said, actually, we don't like having this Korean church here. They're using all our space. They're getting in the way. And the funny thing is, it's kind of funny, but kind of sad, is the real boiling point was over the kitchen. And here was the big claim of why we can't have the Koreans in our church. It was that their food made the kitchen smell funny. Right? So here's this church growing and thriving in an area where the church had been struggling, and we don't want them here because they make our kitchen smell funny. Probably it wasn't the smell. It was people who didn't want a certain kind of people around. Thankfully, eventually, those voices did not win out, and they continued to coincide together and share the space. But, we can look at those people and say, boy, they really lost a sense of the big picture. Boy, they really missed what Jesus was doing. And that's true, I think. But we all have that capacity to lose the big picture and to become distracted by stuff. And sometimes that stuff may have some importance. It may be okay. It's just not the most important stuff. And therefore, it gets in the way of what is most important, which Jesus says today is being in connection with Him. Sometimes we miss out on the importance of this. I was doing marriage counseling a number of years ago, and what you'll often see is one partner has a sense of faith and the other doesn't. And, I remember the guy in this relationship saying, I've gone to church before, but it just seems like I'm sitting there and I'm doing nothing, And sometimes worship seems like that. It seems so passive. I think on one hand, we like to think of worship as our service to God. It's kind of like our thank you to Jesus. And it can be. This is an okay thing to feel in worship. But the founder of our tradition, Martin Luther, his word for worship was Gottesdienst, which means worship as divine service. But the question is, if this is the idea that worship is divine service, who's doing the service? Who's doing the serving in worship? Well, the interesting thing is, even though we think about it as us serving God, in Luther's view, the person who is doing the service, first and foremost, is God. God is doing the work. God is working in us and on us and through us. It's God who's hosting us in God's house. It's God who's teaching us in the Scriptures. It's God who's inviting us to His table. It's God who's serving us His presence in communion. So in the end, Martha's main problem was that she thought that she was the host when in fact Jesus was hosting them. Jesus was trying to serve her. And so if you're a doer, if you like to get your hands dirty, if you like to get involved in your life and in your faith, if you're like Martha, God bless you. The world needs people like you, and certainly the church needs people like you. You're the reason many things get done in this world. But today Jesus reminds us that all of us, every single one of us, whether we're young or old, whether we're men or women, whether we're experienced Christians or new Christians or thinkers or doers, all of us also need to leave space to simply spend some time with Jesus and listen and be and receive. So the question today is not whether or not we're really ready to serve Jesus. The question is, are we ready to slow down and be served by Jesus? Are we ready to sit at Christ's feet and simply receive what God wants to give us? May it be so. Amen.